Welcome to Raw Food. What's happening, Jay?
Not a lot, just the fate of the Senate, which was already kind of decided, but now we know for certain the last remaining Senate seat has been decided. And I wanted to get your rapid reaction. You just said something that was very interesting. So why don't we start there?
I don't even remember what I said, but praise be. So Warnock won by the skin of his asshole. I think the difference in votes was about 30,000, which I think is shameful considering that the opposing candidate was talking about werewolves in the last 72 hours rather than the issues that are impacting the citizens in the state of Georgia. It's just shameful all the way around that the Republicans thought they could just wheel out any old black guy that used to play ball and think that all black people would have been swindled. Thankfully, there was enough people with the brain to not fall for the okey doke and the fugazi nonsense that came with that candidate. And that now has given the Democrats, good or bad, the Senate majority. What say you?
First and foremost, like we've been saying before, I don't even have a problem with the GOP running a articulate, educated, principled, qualified candidate. And if they just, for the sake of campaigning, believe that candidate needed to be black to go up against Warnock, fine.
Sure. Fair
In
enough.
the same vein of Thomas Sowell, Alan Keyes, Larry
Right.
Elder, even Candace Owens is more articulate than Herschel Walker and therefore possibly more qualified. No problem with that. And there are plenty of people, black folks included, in Georgia that check every single one of those boxes.
Right.
The Georgia GOP decided to skip over all of those people and go with the guy who played football.
Right. So was football enough?
It was enough for him to win the nomination, which is still shameful, as you put it.
Shameful.
This guy is the embodiment of all negative stereotypes about black people. He's the embodiment of what Republicans in Georgia think about black people. He's athletic. He has a history of violence. He does not take care of his kids. He has a bunch of kids by a bunch of different women. He's not principled. He paid for abortions, but he wants to outlaw abortion for everyone else. He is a pathological liar. He has low character. He's all of the things that they think about us. And then they held him up and said, hey, all of you niggers, here's a role model for you because we said so.
Right. And then they wheeled out Mr. Bojangles with him and his football, a guy who has admitted to having multiple personalities. He lied about graduating from college. He lied about being part of law enforcement. He lied about owning a franchise. He talks about werewolves and vampires. He has a poor relationship with his children. There have been substantially validated evidence that he has paid for at least 2 abortions. When are Christians going to start acting like one?
In America, never, because power is more important.
Then we get the leaders we settle for.
Yes. The Christians in Georgia, especially the evangelical Christians in Georgia, would rather vote for the philandering, abusive, pathological liar who paid for abortions rather than the guy who is the pastor, and not just any church, Martin Luther King's church. Because that guy is okay with gay marriage and is okay with a woman having bodily autonomy.
That's pretty much what it seems to come down to from some of the interviews that I've seen of voters in Georgia. The majority of them, it was about abortion.
And that's interesting too, because you would expect if it was about abortion, my opinion, my understanding of Georgia is that it would have been an overwhelming victory for Walker. Right. So either I am mischaracterizing how people in Georgia think about abortion. Maybe it's not, maybe it doesn't have as much support. Maybe an outright abortion ban doesn't have as much support as we think in a place like Georgia, or Walker's flaws really weighed him down and it wasn't actually just a centerpiece issue, or the fact that it was a centerpiece issue took a back seat to how much of a flawed candidate Walker was? What do you think?
I think there was a couple of contributing factors. I would say first and foremost, the red wave never came. And because of this runoff, it missed kind of the excitement around the midterm elections, right? This is weeks out from those elections, and those election results did not produce the red phenomena that was predicted. Donald Trump was not invited to campaign on Herschel Walker's behalf. Surprising, because 30% of the Republican Party is still completely and totally beholden to him as the leader of the party. Additionally, I think independents and moderates tipped the scale, as well as early voting. Even though the Republicans did try to impact voting accessibility in this election. And it's important to know that runoffs in Georgia have a racist history. They spring from Jim Crow.
Please expound.
Off the top of my head, because I like to have my extensive research done before we talk about anything. But if I remember correctly, sometime in the 60s, you know what? Let me not speak on it. I'd like to actually collect my thoughts on this because it does have an interesting history. What I do remember, though, is that its roots are in Jim Crow, and it had something to do with the overwhelming amount of freed Black people in the state of Georgia. And the runoffs were a way to basically say, we're not sure that these Black people really know how to vote, so we're going to make them do it twice to prove that their votes actually produce the results that they did. It's basically an insult. Why did Warnock have to run so much? The man ran about 5 times in the last 2 years.
Yes. Because he was filling, what happened? He was filling someone else's seat, right?
Yes.
I forget whose seat it was. But yeah, he didn't get a full term. He was completing someone else's term, and now he's going to have a full term.
Right. I will do a follow-up on it because it's important to understand the history and understand the impact of runoffs and what voter suppression looks like. So, for example, one of the things that keeps coming up under voter suppression is the issue around ID. Now, most of us take having a photo ID as a given, but it's actually an upper middle class and higher form of identification, because most rural areas in the United States, which there are more rural areas than there are city areas, those areas, overwhelmingly, people do not have photo ID. What it takes to get photo ID is a series of steps that if you are poor or working class or working poor, you don't have the means to get. First of all, the overwhelming population of people in small towns in the South and the Appalachias tend to be people who are descendants of slaves, meaning none of their ancestors had identification because they were never legal citizens at the time. If you come from a family that doesn't necessarily have photo ID, you may have to go get the different elements needed to get one form of photo ID. So if you need a passport, you need a driver's license and a couple of other forms of ID. In order to get a driver's license, you have to have a social security number. In order to get that social security number, you need to have a copy of your original birth certificate. There are plenty of descendants of people who come from people who didn't have birth certificates. So how can you get photo ID? Now, if you're going to go through those steps and actually make the effort to get the ID, now you have to take off work because you have to go to DMV, or you have to go to the Social Security office to get a replacement Social Security card. That's a day off work, that's gas money, and that's money to actually get the replacement. Upon getting the replacement, then you now need to go to the DMV, fill out the paperwork, and submit the paperwork along with your original birth certificate in order to get a driver's license. These are days off from work. This is money. And in most of these rural areas, the DMV is anywhere between 20 to 45 to an hour away. Just because resources are available doesn't mean people have access to them.
Yes. And in these states that are adopting such stringent voter ID laws, they're shutting down DMVs. They are cutting the hours that the DMVs are open. So the process by which you would go about it is they're making it even harder. Now, if someone's going to drive, then they need that ID anyway. So a lot of folks will just have someone drive them or whatever. The point is, it's unnecessarily difficult. Whereas in other states like California, if you don't have a driver's license, you can at least get an official state ID.
Yes.
And they make it a lot easier to get it.
Yes.
Because they actually want you to have one.
Right.
So you apply online, you can submit your forms online. It's a lot more difficult in places like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, etc.
Right. I mean, you're talking about some of the poorest counties in the United States, with Mississippi hosting the county with the poorest people in it. And when we talk about the poorest people in the United States, we're talking about generational poverty. We're talking about 3-4 generations of people who have never made more than the lowest amount for working poor or welfare recipient candidates. We're talking about those amongst us that really are the poorest amongst us, which is what made what Brett Favre did so wrong. And again, if we're going to be burning Kyrie Irving at the stake and Kanye West at the stake, I'm wondering why we don't have that same fervor from somebody who stole millions of dollars from the poorest people in the United States outside of the Native American community. Shame on us. We get the leaders we settle for, so don't complain.
Yeah, I agree with that. Brett Favre should not only be in jail, he should be under the jail. And it is amazing how fast the media has moved on from discussing Brett Favre. It is disappointing that not even sports media is covering everything he's done and all the other people that he was in cahoots with.
Yes.
You can only hope that the news cycle will spin back up when criminal charges or a grand jury, when something happens. Because particularly with Mississippi, and not getting off topic, but just wanted to point out, there are some folks that are more mad about Deion Sanders leaving Jackson State than Brett Favre and what Brett Favre did. And also
are upset with Kyrie Irving for posting the link than for Jeff Bezos for hosting that movie and the producers on his streaming service.
Well, I agree with Jeff Bezos leaving hosting the movie, because I believe you should still be able to buy it. I believe you should be able to buy a copy of Mein Kampf on Amazon or whatever. I don't believe in that level of censorship. If for nothing more than someone doing research on hate speech.
Right. Agreed. I don't think we should be censoring any human thoughts. I think we as a society should be coming up with our own moral code as we evolve into better beings, based on the presumption that when we know better, we do better. But perhaps we don't. Right.
But people were very, very upset. Also, I think Kyrie just kind of teased it out a bit in terms of just doubling down. But we can do a whole podcast on Kyrie and Kanye.
You say the same thing about Kanye, because Kanye is not crazy. And I wish we'd stop saying he's crazy. Mental illness has nothing to do with saying racist shit.
That is a good point. He has told everyone that he is bipolar, though. And he also said that he doesn't take his meds.
He could say whatever he wants. I mean, isn't that part of the marketing? I mean, every time he says something, everybody's on his nutsack. So isn't it part of the marketing? I mean, to your point, you always call him a Kardashian. Just because he says something don't make it so. It just generates conversation.
Yeah.
It generates hype.
Has he actually been diagnosed by a medical professional as being bipolar? I don't know, but he has definitely told people, he has publicly stated multiple times that he is bipolar. And he's also publicly stated multiple times that he, does not really take the meds that have been prescribed or recommended to him.